Jesus said, "The hour is soon coming when those in the graves will hear his voice and come out." I want to talk today about the comfort of his voice. I want to talk today about the comfort of his voice. But I want to start off by telling a story from my life, but I think it's one that pretty much everyone in this room probably has a very, very similar story that they may still remember. This happened to me when I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, and my mother took us to Sears. I can't remember why. I think we were getting like a toaster oven or something like that. You don't see Sears around anymore, but probably most of us do remember. You remember it was one of those big department stores that was just sprawling. It just went on and on and on. And so for a little 4 or 5-year-old, right, it was a great place to run around and get into trouble. What I remembered I loved most of all when we went to Sears was those clothing racks where the clothing is in a circle, right? You're all nodding, those of you who have kids, remember. Because if you're a little kid, you knew something about those clothing racks, which was that in the middle there was a little space that you could hide. So I was running around going from one to another, having a great time. And then there was a moment where I slipped out and I looked around and I couldn't find my mother. And I looked everywhere, I tried to find her everywhere, and I just couldn't see her. And this moment, this terrible moment of dread fell upon me. Did y'all have a moment like that when you were a kid, when you lost your mother? And you remember that feeling, what it was like when you lost them? Like you thought that the world was going to come to an end, like everything was going to fall apart. There was no hope for you. And it wasn't just that you had lost them, but that you felt lost yourself, like you didn't know what was going to happen to you next. There's a hymn, an old church hymn, that captures that feeling in a beautiful and brilliant way. And those of you who have heard my singing voice will know that I'm about to embarrass myself, but I'll sing it for you and you'll probably remember. It goes like this. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. I know you know this one, right? It's a powerful hymn and it hits us. And for me, partly it hits me because it connects that feeling that almost all of us have had at some point in our childhood of losing our parents, right? And that feeling we still have as adults sometimes, that we are adrift and lost and we don't know what's coming next. Whether it's because we're dealing with the death of a loved one, or a diagnosis of an illness that we don't know what's happening next, or maybe we've lost a job or encountered a financial hardship, or simply feeling like all of the plans that we had for our lives are not coming together the way we had hoped. Or maybe when we look at the news and the way the world is going and ask ourselves, will there be a world left for my children or grandchildren? We feel like sometimes like motherless children, lost and alone, and in that moment we feel a deep and profound ache, a longing desire for the voice that will comfort us. The end of my story, and I hope the end of yours too, since you're here, right, was that I was running around getting more and more panic and terrified. I cried out, and finally I heard my mother's voice call my name. And I heard in her calling her name that she was afraid as well, but I knew it was going to be okay. I knew that I had been found. Now there is, even in that moment of being found, a little uncertainty and dread, right? Jesus called it out when he said in the gospel, you heard this point. All will hear his voice, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. And for me at 4 years old, even as I was feeling the comfort of knowing I had been found, I knew that I had wandered off when she had told me not to. So I was grateful that I was found, but I was a little fearful. Was this going to end in a spanking, right? Still grateful to be found. We ache and we long to hear the voice of the one who will call for us and care for us. It was in the psalm today, and you read it as well, when we say, I called in my affliction to she who hears me and saved me from all my troubles. We want to hear the voice that will tell us, your story is not over yet. This is not how it ends. And Jesus teaches us something about that in the gospel lesson today. Now there's this habit that I want us all to develop when we read Scripture. And you've heard me mention it before, and I'm not always as good about it as I should be, but I really want you to get in the habit. And it's about looking at the whole context of the passage, about what's happening around it when Jesus talks. And the reason that this matters is really simple. Many years ago when I was in seminary, I happened to bump into a high school teacher of mine. She had taught a class on comparative religion in my high school. And I bumped into her on the subway while I was studying to be a priest. And she looked so relieved. And she said, "Peter, I'm so glad to see you. You see, next week I have to go to a family funeral. And I can't teach my class, and I can't find a substitute. So I was really hoping you could teach it for me." And I was like, I'm happy to help, but I've never taught before. Do you have any suggestions? And she said this thing, which I remember always, and Jesus knows this really well. Be really careful, she said, about answering questions that no one is asking. Be really careful, she said, about answering questions that no one is asking. We've all done this sometimes, where we get off on our hobby horse, the thing that really matters to us, and we watch someone's eyes glaze over. Because what we're saying has nothing to do with the troubles that they're facing right now. It has nothing to do with what they need to learn. And so when I say we got to read the whole passage in its context, it's because when we look in the Gospels, Jesus is really good about that. Pay attention when he teaches. He is always teaching in response to a question someone has raised. He's always teaching in response to a crisis in someone's life or a criticism that he has received. He's always responsive to the needs of God's people. And this is true here as well. So I want to give you the context. This happens John chapter 5. It's in the beginning of his ministry. And he's responding to a scandal. He's responding to a criticism. And you may know this story. One day he was walking past this place called the Pool of Bethesda, which was right outside of Jerusalem. It was this deep, deep pool, and the people believed that the angels stirred it up. So if you could get into this pool when it was bubbling up and stirring up, you would be healed. And you had to go down this long staircase down to get there. And Jesus is walking past, and he sees a man who's sitting there, right, crippled, struggling. And he says to him, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I want to get down into the pool. But 30 years I've been waiting here. 30 years I've been waiting here. And every time someone steps over me and have no one to help me down." And Jesus says to him, "You've been healed. Get up, take your mat, and walk away." He does it, right? And then the religious scholars, the teachers, right, see this happening and they get all upset because it was the Sabbath day, right? And they've got this idea in their heads that there's a way that things should be done. There's an order to how things should happen. And this is out of order. And they tell Jesus that, right? They said, there are 6 days you could have healed him on. Why did you have to do it today? And Jesus says, my Father is always at work. And so I must be at work as well. And then they get really mad, right? Because they said, well, he just said that God is his Father. Again, I mentioned about listening to context, because if they had listened to more of Jesus' teaching, they would have noticed that he says God is all our fathers. But they missed that point. They have a sense that there's an order and a way that things should happen, an orderly kind of way that people should receive God's grace. I think I understood for the first time just how frustrating and angering that must have been to God the day that I lost my son, who's here, in a department store as well. And I felt the dread that my mother must have felt when I went missing. And I was tearing around yelling out his name. And I had people telling me to calm down. And I imagine that's what God feels like when God's people, the religious folk who wear these things, are saying there's an order to how people should receive the grace of God. And God is saying, I am trying to find my lost children. How dare you tell me that? I mention that, though, because this is the context Jesus gives this teaching. The religious scholars have said there's 6 days you could have healed this guy on, and how dare you say that you are the Son of God? And then Jesus begins talking about the resurrection, as if to tell them, boy, if this pissed you off, if this made you angry, just wait, because the big news is still coming. Even the dead in their graves will hear the voice of the Son of God and will come out. So Jesus takes this opportunity to teach us something about resurrection, about the new life that God brings. And in the context of this story, when we think about this man who'd been sitting at the top of the staircase for 30 years waiting for someone just to notice him, someone to take 5 minutes and help him down the stairs, and who had been ignored so long, I think Jesus is telling us that resurrection in a certain sense is all about the comfort of hearing God's voice. In that moment when we feel lost and alone and adrift, of hearing the voice of God that says to us, You are seen, you are remembered, and your story does not end here. That there is still more to come and more grace. And that resurrection shows up in our lives in so many different ways, whether it's in the comfort and consolation when we feel like, I don't know how I'm going to make it to tomorrow. When we feel like all of my plans and hopes have fallen apart, and what will come next? The voice of the risen one who says to us, your story does not end here. And Jesus drives it really hard home by, he says, and even when you lie in your graves, even at that moment where you said the final period has been stamped on my life, still you will hear the voice of God saying, you are not forgotten. There is more to come. This is the comfort and the consolation of God's voice in our lives. The promise and the hope that in the moments when we say, Lord, I am a motherless child, we hear the voice of calling out and saying, no, you are mine, remembered, and not forgotten. This is the promise of resurrection in our lives. And there is nothing that can stop it from reaching us, not even all of the religious rules and strictures that we impose and in place of how people should receive the good news. Nothing can separate us from the voice of God that is calling us each day to new life. And my prayer is that each of us hears it today. Amen.